oldie but goodie. Okay, our next featured reader is Sara Brody, who is a writer, but she hates writing bios. Her work has appeared in Narrative Magazine, the Adroit Journal, the Columbia Journal, and elsewhere. Everybody, please welcome Sara.
Hi there. So, I'm writing a novel about Jonestown, which I think everyone knows.
What?
I know. I don't bring it up that much, especially not with my customers at Whole Foods. It's real. I'm reworking some of the chapters as short stories, so this actually stands alone, which makes it different than anything else I've ever shared here and in workshop. So yeah, this is a short story / chapter from my novel. It's called The Other Side. And this isn't the whole thing, it's just the first 8 pages. When I was a kid, my dad had an affair with his secretary, which might make you think I also had a dog and a picket fence and a mother whose complicated feelings eluded me. The mother part, I guess, is true, but first I want to tell you about Ingrid, whose secretarial tasks included rifling through dumpsters, breaking into houses, wiretapping phones, stealing mail, all in the name of socialism, to give my father credibility as a prophet, a healer, the divine incarnate of Lenin. It worked. Being a good secretary, she left a wide paper trail, so I know a lot about her, but I'm not sure what I knew back then. Did I ever notice, for instance, that all the women whom Dad healed during church services looked uncannily alike? Ingrid in blackface, Ingrid in a wheelchair, blind Ingrid wearing sunglasses. Who would want to notice a thing like that? When, during a church picnic, she hid in the vineyards and fired off a few shots, when Dad shrieked and keeled over, I felt my heart drop into my stomach, my mind turning somersaults, my muscles frozen, trapped in the terrible fantasy of what it would mean to lose my father. I was 9, I think. Maybe I was 10, and I know that I loved him, the rare moments we spent together, roughhousing on the lawn, playing catch. I know that I felt proud to be his son. Moments later, he rose to his feet, triumphant, telling us that he'd dissolved the bullet. Look, it wasn't the worst childhood in the world, not by any stretch. Until I was 13, we lived in a 2-story house in Ukiah, the lawn reedy and dry, a tire swing affixed to the branches of an elm tree. I had a monkey. I had an ostrich. My father had a mistress who, he gently explained, had been with him through so many lives, when he was Jesus, when he was Lenin, and he took us together on long, aimless drives, trying to make us talk. Ingrid would stare out the window, chewing on her bottom lip, her hands knotted in her lap, while Dad at her side would grow giddy, his grip tight on the steering wheel, his face split into a grin. I didn't dislike Ingrid, who seemed afraid of me, unable to meet my eyes, always dropping things in my company. I was jealous of her, a mousy, willowy woman who somehow held my father's attention completely, his eyes lighting up when she spoke, and I wanted her to go away. Finally, she did go away, when he got her pregnant. She stayed with her mother in Berkeley. He told the congregation she'd gone on a secret mission to Mexico, where soon she was imprisoned for revolutionary activities, because that's how babies are made, right? In the winter of 1975, we moved to San Francisco, where Dad said we could have a real impact, where people would be more receptive to our socialist and integrationist ideals, no matter if our enemies wanted to destroy us. I lived with my parents in an apartment on the top floor of our church on Geary Boulevard, a place cluttered with unfamiliar faces, men in suits who shook hands with my dad, tough, tired men and women who cried at his words. Members of the congregation sold their property and possessions, moving into communes scattered around the city, and we used the money to provide health care, legal aid, food, and shelter to the poor. We canvassed for politicians, showing up at demonstrations by the hundreds, and Dad's reputation grew. To Angela Davis, Huey Newton, and Dennis Banks, he raised a clenched fist, while he shook hands with George Moscone and Willie Brown. At services, he opened his pulpit to Chilean refugees, Native American activists, Pan-Africanist and anti-colonial leaders, and I would fidget in the pews, waiting for him to take the stage again, to see his face spotlit and glowing. I liked to watch people watch him, the way their mouths would hang open and their eyes would widen, and I liked knowing they didn't know him. They didn't know, for instance, that sometimes he took me to the movies, despite proclaiming that movies were frivolous and counter-revolutionary. They didn't know about the funny green kimono he wore around the apartment, and certainly they'd never seen him eat cereal. Yet now there was no time for movies, with Dad hobnobbing with politicians, fundraising, recruiting new members, and more often than not I ate breakfast alone. I didn't see much of Mom because Dad said that she was mentally unstable, that she needed to stay in bed, that I should leave her alone and let her rest. For the most part, I kept to myself because the only other guy my age who lived in the church was Octavius Mosby. Octavius Mosby was a skinny black kid with a wild cloud of hair, who once tried to strangle Billy Holloway for making fun of his buck teeth. Billy's face turning blue, his eyes bulging, before finally Phil Thurman, who was 6 years older and twice Mosby's size, managed to break up the fight. Mosby'd also strangle you if you called him Octavius, and especially if you said a word about his dad, who had defected from the church years ago, leaving him in his mother's care. I didn't want to get strangled, but that wasn't why I avoided him. It was because he'd always meet my dad's eyes when he came forth to be thwacked during services, never blinking, his back straight and his chest puffed out. Unafraid of Molly Wyrick, the heavy-set blonde woman who wielded the paddle, a preschool teacher by day whose eyes would change when she did the thwacking, with a strange, classy look. It was because he kept breaking rules, getting in fights at school, sassing the church counselors, skipping choir practice, even as the number of thwacks grew from 20 to 50, 50 to 100. We called it catharsis, a ritual of confrontation, punishment, and forgiveness, meant to help people learn, but Mosby refused. When he spoke the words, "I'm sorry, Father," I could tell he wasn't, that Dad couldn't make him sorry. So I spent most of my time with my snails, which I plucked from the bushes and kept in a bucket behind the church. I guess the story starts with Mosby, a cold day in February just after my 13th birthday. I'd lined up my snails on the pavement for a race when he came over and sat by my side, wearing a red t-shirt with one sleeve torn along the seam to his armpit, his mouth and eyelids drooping. I rolled my shoulders forward, feeling the muscles tense on the sides of my neck, and in silence we watched my snails sludge around. Then Mosby pulled $1 out of his sock, tapped one of the snails with his finger, and said, "I'm putting $1 on this guy. What are my odds?" I stared at him. I couldn't figure out why he'd do such a stupid thing because we weren't supposed to have money. The adults got $2 a week for allowance. Everything else came through the church, food, healthcare, housing. So $1 was a huge deal, and my first thought was to find my dad and tell him. It wasn't that I liked to get other kids in trouble. It sort of made me feel like slime, how people would shy away from me, conversations cut short when I approached. But I loved the way Dad's face would light up, how he'd say what a good socialist I was, how alike we were. I tried with everything in me to make him proud, memorizing vocabulary words in Russian so I could be more like Lenin, studying until dawn so I could get straight A's, and I followed every rule. There were a lot of rules. The adults weren't allowed to drink, smoke, or have sex because it would distract them from the cause. The women couldn't wear makeup or keep their hair long because it was egoistical and capitalistic. All of us kids had to be model citizens at school, maintaining at least a B average, and no one was too old or young for a thwacking. So I knew I had to tell on Mosby and fidgeted with my shoelaces, triple knotting them, trying to think of an excuse to leave and find my dad. Then I thought, where the hell is my dad anyway? He was all over the place, all the time, and there was something extra weird about this that threw me off. Usually I caught people doing bad things, spotted other kids hanging around with outsiders at school, overheard them whining about how tired they were. It wasn't the average person who broke rules and flaunted it, practically asking to be ratted on, and I wanted to know what Mosby was thinking. So finally I said, "How am I supposed to pay you if I win?" Mosby raised his fist and crushed my snail into the pavement. "I lost," he said. "Keep it." And he left. I still don't know what that was about, what was swimming around in his head when he did that, and I guess I'll never know. Mosby got thwacked nearly every week, and on that day I got to wondering if he liked the pain, if he was looking for it. I watched him walk away, his hands jammed in his pocket, shoulders hunched, and wondered why he didn't want to be a good socialist, why he didn't care about the cause. I knew that capitalism left people behind, kept poor people poor, treated them like dirt, and it seemed the only way to find sense in it was to tell Dad, to see what he'd say and do, even though I knew what he'd say and do, that Mosby would be thwacked again, that I'd stand before the congregation holding a microphone to his mouth so that everyone could hear him scream. I would feel his breath on my hand, the sharp bursts of breath. I would close my eyes and listen to the paddle whoosh through the air, and it would make me want to know him, to understand who he was and why he asked for it, to know how badly it hurt. I'd seen people thwacked for the smallest things, dozing off for an instant during services, not clapping loudly enough, singing off key, but I'd never once been called to the floor to be punished. All the time I wondered why. I tucked the dollar in my sock, feeling uneasy about it, and that night, after choir practice and tutoring, once alone in my room, I took it out and laid it flat on my desk. I'd seen dollars, of course, but I realized then I'd never really looked at one, and stared for a long time at George Washington's drawn face, his lips thin and downturned at the corners, his eyelids drooping, a bored, lazy stare as though he wanted nothing to do with me or anyone. I sort of liked him. I wished I could ask him what was going on, what he'd seen. I wished in a small way that I could keep the dollar for a while, not for capitalistic reasons, but for company, and wondered if that's why Mosby had been carrying it around in the first place, if maybe he wasn't a capitalist at all. Then I thought about all the bad things he'd done, how once he'd gone to an outsider's house after school and spent the afternoon watching television, the time he'd kicked in the walls in his dorm room, and I knew that I was making excuses. Why did I care if he was whacked? Didn't he deserve it every time? I thought of my dad and felt a twinge in the pit of my stomach like hunger, my dad who I'd never lied to, whose luminous grin would seem to hang in the air even after he looked away, and I knew I wouldn't stop feeling that awful emptiness until I told. Almost a week passed before I crossed paths with Dad a Sunday morning, and he'd come home to prepare his sermon for the evening service. He gave a start when I barged into his office, turned in his swivel chair, and grinned at me. "Hello, Squirt," he said. "What's new?" I drew closer, wanting for some reason to touch his bicep, to squeeze the muscle and check how strong he was. I opened my mouth to tell him about Mosby, but then he took off his sunglasses, his eyes so startlingly red that I had to look away. It came to me with a jolt that I could have told any adult about Mosby, that I could have done this days ago, that all along I'd wanted the credit for telling, when what mattered was stopping Mosby from breaking rules. It was strange. Sometimes just the sight of Dad could make me realize all the things I was doing wrong, things that had never once come to mind before. How often I zoned out in math class, that I missed going to movies even though they were capitalistic, that sometimes I worried about God hating me even though he wasn't real. I glanced at Dad, waiting for him to read in my eyes that I'd screwed up, but he only rested his hand on my shoulder and said, "You all right, Squirt?" "Mosby stole $1, I mumbled. "What?" "Mosby stole $1, I said again, staring down at my shoes. Dad's grip tightened on my shoulder, and when I looked up, I saw his grin stretching from ear to ear. "That little fucker," he said. "We'll show him, won't we?" "Uh-huh." "You go have fun," Dad said, moving his hand to the back of my neck, giving it a squeeze. "I'll see you tonight." For a moment I stared at him, not wanting to leave, meaning to give him the dollar. I imagined slapping it into his palm and maybe he'd say, "Hey, stick around, why don't you?" I'd curl up on the sofa and watch him work, the way I did when I was a little kid. But I couldn't remember the last time he'd let me do that, because everything was a secret now, everything fraught with danger. Dad said that racists and conservatives wanted to assassinate him for pushing for integration, that they hated the thought of a white pastor championing the plight of urban blacks. He said that our enemies in the press were determined to tell lies about us, that the FBI and IRS were tracking him, that I had to be wary of all outsiders. It sort of made sense to me. In Ukiah, rednecks had thrown bricks through the windows of the church, shouted slurs at members, but I wanted to know what really went on behind the scenes. Ingrid, before she'd left, had passed hours in Dad's office, conversing with him in undertones, and I wondered what he told her that I wasn't allowed to know about, what made her so special. In that moment she swam into my head, not the way she did during services, as someone far away and lost to us, but the real Ingrid, the one in Berkeley. I remembered her slipping in and out of Dad's office in Ukiah with stacks of paperwork cradled to her chest. Her footsteps soft in the middle of the night, and the pain in my stomach got so bad it made my throat constrict. I put my hand on Dad's shoulder, feeling the roughness of his polyester suit jacket. I said, "See ya," and left. Not until I was outside with my snails did I remember the dollar and sprinted back upstairs, but when I reached the apartment, Dad was gone again. Thanks, guys.